final curtain call. This is a series of thoughts regarding the last 6 weeks of geopolitical and domestic developments, the fabrication of the emerging new social narrative of the wavering paradigm of Western hegemony, and the ensuing of chaos worldwide, acting as a smokescreen for what seems to be the advent of the digitization of the political, social, and economic fabric of the incipient stakeholder despotism. Recall Bertrand Russell's comments, of which I cannot reiterate here for fear of censorious reprisal by YouTube, but he stated that every century or so it is prudent to unleash the four horsemen, those who maintain the spinning of time upon the samsara, pestilence, war and famine. That said, whenever radically reimagining technologies are to be foisted on the common folk by their shadowy masters, who sit opulently in their grand villas dotted on the periphery of the plantation, then it is effective to have a series of distractions and acts of mass depopulation as a means of shock and awe against the domestic and global populace, and thus they are smashed into line by the whip of psychodramas and strapped to the conveyor belt of the future, whether the common folk like it or not, where human freedom is crushed further into the mud, where the water of life meets the mundane earth, there shall be fire, and the smoke shall carry screams into the air above. The animal farm, where the sweat of toil fills our troughs, where the confines of our pen are marked not by electrified wire fencing, but by the shocking thought of leaving the convenience of the pen, and the miserly farmer's callousness is only trumped in disbelief by the miserably farmed's loyal refusal to think. Anyway, to digress, let us now go through this collection of thoughts on the present geopolitical and global situation as of April and May 2023. It is the end of Western civilization as we know it. Our allotted time has passed and everything shall come undone. The actors behind this all, the ones whose master is the demiurge, the Yabulon, have already moved east. One of my first videos was on this fact. I suspect they will wish to artificially collapse and slaughter everything in their wake, thus expect famine and a general breakdown of society. Moreover, to ensure that we cannot rebuild quickly, they have imported large swathes of diverse and oppositional, adventitious contingents, which will assuredly bring us a fragmented and factionalized patchwork of tribal states in the former nations of Europe and the US. Divide and conquer, that is the demiurge's modus operandi. Ultimate suffering through the seeds of chaos coming to full bloom. In time, once we reassert unopposed dominance within all of our homelands, this is internationally speaking, vis-a-vis total and unequivocal neutralization of the forces that underpin chaos, then we must ensure we do whatever is necessary to destroy the agents of the demiurge, which at that point will be thoroughly ingrained in their new eastern host. The demiurgic agents, those rats that chew through the body of the ornate ship, and then do jump onto a new ship once their old host has sunk. Indeed, if this coming war for the liberation of humanity results in the destruction of the entire earth, then so be it. The endless cycles of engineered suffering for the betterment of forces incomprehensible must end. Once they are defeated, and they will be, upon this physical plane, then they must be conquered in what we would call the material planes. Again, if this ends in the destruction of the universe, then so be it. For if the universe is parasitical, then it is already destined for such destruction. Through destruction can something new then take its place, and indeed the new cannot be any worse than the old, so change must be pursued with every ounce of faith that we can muster. We need a new spiritual path, an order that covers itself in shadows, and is entirely set upon destroying, or at least hindering, the host of destruction in the ages to follow the conclusion of our ailing one. To stop the turning of the wheel and thus weaken the demiurge and his access to cyclical suffering at the end of every age. To stop the few will save the many, and provide for them the space to breathe and pursue spiritual growth without the artificial inducement of suffering with no let or hindrance. Indeed, we require suffering for spiritual growth, but this is not why the demiurge seeks to induce such suffering. He desires it for the continuance of himself and the space of suffering, to keep the wheels of heaven forever turning, and the wheels of hell. The sacrifices must end. The veneer, the illusion, the facade of normality is fading from this theatre of hate and imperialism. Cataclysm proceeds forth from natural paths of renewal that are vehemently resisted, and truly all conflicts in human history are born of the resistance to change or the desire to induce it. Accordingly, this is at the root of our current geopolitical dilemma and the state of transitional geopolitics within the 21st century. The only caveat I have to add is that I am sorely depressed in the suffering that shall be borne by the good, common, hard-working people of the West in this dark winter that fast approaches. I would implore them to quicken the collapse of this zombie empire before it makes you, the still living, part of its undead host. For corruption once set into motion can never be stopped. Each evil deed adds to the evil deeds that are gone before, until finally evil destroys itself. The punishment of desire is the agony of unfulfillment. Behold the source of the current maladies within the West. Like the cautionary myth of the Atlantis of old, the cabal seeks dominion over the entire world, and by their hubris in such an undertaking, they have unwittingly sown the seeds of their own destruction. Sadly, it will be the working people who suffer, but in the ash of suffering grows a sapling of potential for a better future and a lasting peace. The West, in its consistent drive for unending world hegemony, like every empire before it, seems to be increasingly galvanizing these Oriental nations into ever more tight-knit economic and defensive alliances. One can identify the clear parallels of this type of polarization through the highly isolating bilateral structure of alliances in every single global conflict within the modern era, from the 30 Years' War to World War II. The jingoistic desire for the centralization of all power, that greed-ridden root, as displayed by the globalists or neo-imperialists, will only ever lead to a disintegration of the old order by an internecine conflict that will radically and uncontrollably reshape the geopolitical and civilizational landscape. There are no winners born of that type of irrationalism, but the nature of power is such that this disastrous trajectory is ultimately unavoidable. The embarrassment of this entire deconstruction of the West, the final twilight before the sun sets upon this period of Western hegemony, is painfully cringe-inducing to watch. It is akin to watching a horror movie where one is screaming at the TV screen to the actors, quote, "The monster's behind you, dummy, look behind you," unquote. However, the script was already written, spoken, and the lines recorded, and all we can undoubtedly do is watch as the crash course and disaster unfolds. Unfortunately, there are forces at play beyond our control, inbuilt into the very psychology of the species, and to change them would require us to change the fabric of reality itself. On Biden's trip to Ireland, it may be said of this that the American, and I use that term in the loosest of senses possible, power brokers, are sending Biden because, funnily enough, they are Biden time for themselves, and attempting to reassert the course to a Leviathan-like internecine conflict with Eurasia, like the Orwellian dystopia of 1984, where the application of the perpetual war doctrine is used to terrible effect to maintain the regime's suppression of life, light, and love. However, it also factors into the potential narrative for the artificial dissolution of the West as we know it, that will justify the transferring of the torch of power from the West to the East. meaning China and Russia. I suspect the US will begin an attempt to reassert their power throughout Europe with more of these visits. It will be a desperate, last attempt, of course. Some US geopolitical analysts have even outrightly called for the support and militaristic galvanizing of the French protests to thus oust Macron. That said, if that was to happen, then it is merely the three-dimensional development. The world is the vellum, future time is the blank pages of this grand epic, and the writers are those who seek the impossible by the edge of the sword and the roar of the flame. It is fascinating to watch this extraordinary theatre, but unfortunately this theatre performance seems to require the audience be the involuntary collateral for the exposition of the story. Blood is always the ink of the narrator of chaos. With the dwindling munitions and ammunition, along with the lack of industrial capabilities comparative to the rise in power of Russia and China, proxy wars such as the one within Ukraine simply are unwinnable by the collective West at this point. The recent aid package to Ukraine from the collective West, primarily the US, proves that. For example, Ukraine expends 2,000 to 6,000 shells per day on average, with the Russians expending easily 20,000 per day on average. Disastrously, Ukraine only received 1 million rounds in the last aid package from the US this year, and will periodically be receiving 1 million more from the strained stockpiles of the EU. As promised but not yet delivered, that amounts to an easily achievable 6,000 rounds per day on average for the next 332 days. Of course, the EU is periodically supplying these rounds, and thus we can only be definitely sure of enough ammunition for 166 days. In terms of 155mm shells, the ubiquitous land-based artillery caliber, the US currently produces 14,000 per year of these, yet Ukraine has expended this much ammunition in a day, though the US is seeking to boost its production of 155mm shells to 24,000 per year by the end of the year. Russia, on the other hand, produces upwards of 1 million of this caliber per year, and had, at the beginning of the conflict, a 15 million stockpile of these specific shells. The quantity of this caliber within the US munitions stockpile is unknown, but it must be low because the US just secured 500,000 of these shells from South Korea, designed to, quote, provide it more flexibility in supplying Ukraine, unquote, which clearly indicates that the US have a depleted and dangerously low number of this important caliber. If we go beyond the naturally deflective diplomatic lingo, moreover, just as a comical side note, we see that the US provided Ukraine in their recent aid package with a strange and downright questionable assortment of arms, vehicles, and munitions, including a great number of experimental weapon systems, which is inefficient and irrational given the time and resources required to properly implement these systems during an ongoing war. However, one of the most comical parts of the recent aid package was the fact that only 11 recovery vehicles, an integral part of any armoured fighting force to recover downed vehicles, of course, a problem that will become even more bothersome come the total thawing of the snow into a slush, which will turn the ground into a boggy mire. Thus, Ukraine has been given 11 vehicles to cover almost an 1,100-mile front in its upcoming and much-hailed counter-offensive. This is obviously a disaster waiting to happen. Along with the untenable military situation, the current Anglo-American hegemony is fracturing and tearing itself apart at the seams, with Macron rebelliously chanting cries of scorn and discontent at the US, desirous of elevating the EU geopolitically into its own independent entity, untethered from US hegemony. Saudi Arabia and Iran have now sealed a rapprochement, along with Saudi Arabia also untethering itself from the US yoke as well. As I stated in my first book, like Rome, the US is losing its eastern or frontier allies, and its sphere of influence and power is contracting rapidly. With Rome, The Italian heartland of the empire was eventually overrun due to political infighting and a foreign realignment of societal and political interests, which is what we see currently plaguing the US. The US, like Rome, could never be militarily conquered, as Hannibal learned, but the only way it could be defeated was by suicide, as we are seeing. The tension must be vented from the collapse, and the Western peoples must be allowed to rebuild once this corrupt house of cards falls into an abyss of its own making. An interesting period to be alive, no doubt. Quote, "In fortune there is misery, but in misery there is also fortune," unquote. We see that within Scotland. There is a political race towards bringing forward as quickly as possible the novel MIG, or the minimum income guaranteed, or an even more radical form of the UBI, where benefits or welfare is conditions based in most of the world. Scotland seeks to make the welfare system rights based, that is, by being a resident of Scotland, which is an increasingly vague and flexible definition, mind you, then one is entitled to a minimum income per annum. Of £25,000 net, £32,000 gross, or with the base rate of tax, under this envisioned scheme of the MIG, or minimum income guaranteed. To put this insanity into perspective fully, then one need only realise that the average income of the Scottish citizen is £27,000 gross. Thus, if one is getting £25,000 as a right contingent on their mere existence, essentially, then the majority of the low-earner workers have no incentive to work, but every incentive to forgo work for the automatic minimum income, or radical UBI. These types of low earners, yet nonetheless important workers, include construction workers, farm workers, delivery drivers, import and export workers, entry-level professional positions, garbage collection, services, and electrical grid maintenance workers, and even entry-level police constables. Therefore, we would be talking about free credit on demand for nothing, yet there would be no goods nor services to buy, nor food, water, or basic amenities available to society. Moreover, to pay for this madness, the government of Scotland is anticipating hiking the tax rate astronomically for medium and high earners, those making above £32,000 in essence. Therefore, social strife and a mass exodus of the professional and business class will ensue as the tax burden will become too unbearable for them, and naturally, they will have a vastly reduced pool of prospective workers to choose from and attract, the businesses, that is. Moreover, we see Biden do a similar thing with his home equity scheme, which will see riskier borrowers be given incentives to take on mortgages, to secure mortgages more easily, and also will have a reduced monthly expenditure on their mortgage payments. This will be, the bill will be fitted for that by citizens with better credit scores, if you will. They will have what seems to be, by the calculations, a 20 to 30% increase on their monthly mortgage payments to fit the bill for these riskier borrowers, again to create mortgage equity, right, like communism, to ensure everyone's poor across the board, to totally distort the economy and to distort personal finances and also the government finances as well. It will all have a knock-on effect, of course. Inevitably, it adds to this desire of the cabal to artificially collapse the West. This will lead, this is in regards to the Scottish scheme of minimum income guaranteed, though it goes without saying, to a total collapse of the society into barbarism, famine, and probable cannibalism within the first year of this puerile scheme. Additionally, Scotland, as a requisite to its own existence, needs alcohol, The population would rebel without it for a plethora of reasons, and the workers of distilleries and the logistical apparatus thereof that supports that business all fall under the category of those who are to be incentivized to steer clear of work for the opportunity of becoming a professional government dependent under this new scheme. Indeed, the definite economic disasters born of this are harrowing enough, but the social issue caused by a population of unfulfilled layabouts cooped up in a domestic prison cell with nothing but vapid entertainment and little to provide their existence purpose is the most dangerous prospect to envision with this. In essence, think of a population that are locked in a perpetual lockdown where they have no part in the story of the future of society, that they are but a monkey in a zoo, merely fed and sheltered for the titillating virtue signallers and the humble brag need of the upper class gentry. That said, there is the stakeholder class that, in their long-term perspective, will seek to extirpate from existence the useless class, the MIGGOTS, if you will, via forced medications and other demographic control measures, those who demand profit and power from the society-turned plantation seek to mitigate liabilities in the long run, to liquidate those liabilities, of course. In conclusion, persuading the undesirable classes into domestic cells is but a means to a genocidalist end, in truth. The UK exhibits every single symptom of a collapse in civilization. It is so demonstrably evident as to be presumed as truth beyond contest. God save our souls, our apathy has led to the ruin of our wonderful isle, and the Lady of Wisdom herself, Britannia, weeps no more, is all her sympathy, her mercy, her tears, has now passed along with the nation she stood vigil over. The British and Western citizens have no idea that what awaits them, and this shall make the collapse of Western Rome look like a leisurely Sunday stroll. A dark age of 1,000 years shall befall us, a tenebrosity shall hang heavy over the West, and we shall only know lives of struggle, and our lot shall be misery redoubled. The only way to stop this future is to force reform. Reform or die. Hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. The West is the target. Quote, "The New World Order cannot become a functional reality so long as the United States remains able to go it alone. If the American people were to awaken to the realities of world politics and regain control over their government, they still would have the economic and military power to break away. Among the world planners, therefore, it has become the prime directive to weaken the United States militarily and economically. The American economy is being deliberately exhausted through foreign giveaways, endless wars, and domestic boondoggles. The object is not to help those in need or defend freedom or preserve the environment, but to bring the system down. Their goal is the deliberate weakening of the industrialized nations as a prerequisite to bringing them into a world government built upon the principles of socialism, with themselves in control," unquote. The narrative of the Kremlin being hit by a drone attack in an attempted assassination plot on Putin has been spun. Expect this as a milestone in further escalation. Fortuitously, this comes on the back of recent issues surrounding the debt ceiling crisis and the other economic dilemmas for the US, including anti-free speech laws throughout the West as well. Hence, this escalation acts as an effective smokescreen for such fiscal misconduct. If you are a fighting age man or woman, they do not discriminate, remember, I would advise you to leave the West now. The great harvest of loosh in this epoch is fast approaching. Oh wait, that is right. We see travel restrictions were put in place, and again fortuitously, we find that Arcturus, the Lord of the Harvest constellation, He who swings the sickle is rearing its oh so ugly head. Thus all potential draftees cannot leave or are hindered at the very least from doing so unless they agree to euthanasia vis-a-vis peddled needlecraft. They want their loosh one way or another, and of course you must be dead for them to harvest said loosh, hence everything we see currently. They have grown the human crop, and now it is time to swing the sickle, for the crop is ripe. Trample the winepress, for the wickedness is said to be sweet to the forked tongue of evil, and so shall the blood rise as high as the horse's bridle. Moreover, a global war permits the venting of hate within the common folk for the transitional period and the ruling class, plus a great cover for the destruction of the West and prosperity. It permits the ruling class to relocate the fighting fit and fighting ready men and women from the country and drop them in a foreign arena of slaughter, fighting for their lives, a quasi-Hunger Games if you will, where they are less of a threat. The perpetual war doctrine as per 1984. I indeed covered this in a video last year as soon as the Russo-Ukraine flashpoint narrative commenced. Quote, "The war is not meant to be won, it is meant to be continuous. Hierarchical society is only possible on the basis of poverty and ignorance. This new version is the past, and no different past can ever have existed. In principle, the war effort is always planned to keep society on the brink of starvation. The war is waged by the ruling group against its own subjects, and its object is not the victory over either Eurasia or East Asia, but to keep the very structure of society intact," unquote. Alas, I would not be surprised if the ruling class staged a fake nuclear attack and corralled people into the megacities on the back of it, isolating them geographically and informationally. From there, the ruling class could hypothetically craft a closed-loop illusion, a matrix, if you will, akin to that of the Divergent series, or even 2001 AD's Judge Dredd setting. Quote, "The outside is contaminated. Stay in the safety of Megacity 1. It is for everyone's safety and security that you do," unquote. Along with that, we see that the WEF plan to covertly or not so covertly implement their Great Reset, where they reset everything, including the human population counter, to 0. And that is fully underway. The everything bubble, that has been brewing for decades now, but was accelerated due to the crisis event we cannot name, ushering in the new decade, is bursting at the seams and is about to pop. Of course, all of these various bubbles and panics have been mapped out since the 1910s, or even prior to that. You can see that fact evident on the screen right now, and hence they are all fabricated and engineered to consequently siphon wealth and property from the common folk, and to re-establish that said wealth and property within the hands of the would-be potentates of the world, the clique that run this world and seek to evidently run it into the ground and place their kingdom upon the smouldering ruins of our once happy lives. First Republic Bank has recently just collapsed, along with some other medium financial institutions a few months back, and the media has reported nothing on the impending popping of this entire debt bubble. Now, of course, cycles of boom and bust are a given within a debt-based charade of an economy and financial system, but once the hegemonic power of the US in the West dwindles, along with the dollar, then such a normal event such as a debt bubble popping could turn into the vertical collapse of the entire financial and, by extension, socio-political system due to the lack of leverage and monetary flexibility afforded to the US and the West by the lessening preeminence of the dollar. First Republic Bank is the second largest bank failure in American history, the largest being that of the Washington Mutual at the height of the 2008 financial crisis. Both of these now defunct banks, I would argue, were intentionally deconstructed and thus made defunct by ulterior interests. Of that fact, we see that both of these banks were bought over by JP Morgan, a partner of the WF, of course. 3 of the 4 largest bank collapses in the financial history of the US and the West have occurred in the last 60 days, give or take, and all Biden can provide in response to this unprecedented development is, quote, "Don't worry about it, man," unquote. Naturally, on the latter, I am paraphrasing for comedic effect. However, what is not a comedy is that this is clearly a once crypto-authoritarian regime now coming out of the shadows and using the pretext of these series of artificial collapses as a thinly veiled mechanism for the centralization of all power, wealth, and the credit supply. This is, obviously, a prerequisite move to ensure that the airtight control of the financial system is resolute, under the complete purview of the direct partners of the WF, the stakeholder class of the future, and is the way they are reshaping the future into a grim dystopia, where they shall own everything, and we shall be but temporary serfs until they can replace us completely with their technology. The banking sector, via the interest hikes of the central banks, have sealed the fate of not just most of the banking sector, but most of the commercial sector entirely. The facade of an economy born out of debt is crumbling in a controlled and engineered manner. The scenery within the theatre is being torn asunder, and in its wake, all that is left for the audience to view is the 4 brick walls of the truth of the lie. Hence, even without directly destroying these banks, though that was done in the case of First Republic, quite severely so, the central bank itself has facilitated this collapse and is leading the way for the onset of Order 66, the final cataclysmic transition from the world of dimming light to the nightmare of total darkness. Indeed, we also see the potential of a default on the US debt due to the lack of political action on a debt ceiling deal within Congress. But of course, these have always resolved themselves at the final call. Thus, it is but another way to simply keep the country constantly teetering on the edge of fearful collapse. Although, either way, in the imminent future, the US economy, due to failing tax revenues and other systemic imbalances within the overall society, will be unable to meet the demand of the ever-expanding debt obligation, and as always, money printer shall go brrr, so to speak. Hyperinflation will eventually destroy the dollar, and that hyperinflationary drive will only be accelerated with the onset of de-dollarization, as we are seeing throughout the world currently. The inflationary chickens will come home to roost, so to say. What proof do we possess that hyperinflation will be seen within this decade, probably prior to 2025? Well, billionaires, a record number of them in fact, are beginning to take multiple mortgages on residential property, along with them outrightly snatching vast swathes of arable and commercially viable land. Why does this indicate hyperinflation? Well, in the event of hyperinflation, the most advantageous thing one could have prior to the onset of it is a fixed rate mortgage, or any fixed rate liability really. Why? Simply put, when hyperinflation, or the runaway increase in the monetary supply, leads to a hyper-debasement of the currency, then fixed rate items, fixed in the pre-hyperinflation value terms, would ensure that one could pay off the principal easily, as at that point, cash would have become worthless confetti. That said, such a scenario would lead the banks to cease lending, and furthermore, this would lead a country whose economy is built on debt to begin to dry up, and only further compound the hyperinflation. Hypothetically, once this scenario had matured sufficiently and a greater depression than the Great Depression had set in, then one could see how the chaos and frenzy seeded would permit the order to subsequently be offered as a solution to a weary and terrified public. The public alert system would announce the establishment of a temporary CBDC system buffer, a digital currency that would protect the depositors and their assets from further loss and provide much needed stability to the economy, of course. Time would then pass, and the human cattle would be conditioned to their new monetary feed, some even preferring the convenience of servitude to freedom, and thus the temporary CBDC, the lifeline of a nation in peril, would become enshrined in law. Fast forward 30 years later, and the US is no longer legally a republic. The pretense has completely vanished, and in its place stands a rule by stakeholder, a digital feudal plutocracy. The citizen has made way for the serf, and the rights once enshrined in law have suddenly made way for privileges conditionally received upon the report of a good social credit score. Through pharmacological means, the population would have a life expectancy that would barely go above 30 years of age. Women would be abolished and replaced with artificial wombs. That is the final end goal of feminism. And UBI, or the MIG, would keep one alive on condition of compliance with any diktat from the central stakeholder Politburo. This is the future if we do nothing about it, and continue to settle in silence for the hope of a dream of life. Let us not hope. Let us carve out of the weavers of disorder's heart the future we want and the future we deserve. We who toil, we who break our backs to provide them their riches that they callously use to torture us and our children with. We who know of pain and the tumult of responsibility. They, on the other hand, know nothing bar the shadow of deceit and the lustful temptress of power. They revel in depravity and suckle from the black milk of debauchery. They chew on the cud of their own vanity and wax lyrically their own faux triumphs.